Thank you all for your time today. We're very pleased to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Robert Lempert. Robert Lempert is a principal researcher at the RAND Corporation and the director of the Pardee Center for Long-Range Global Policy and the Future of Human Condition of the RAND Corporation. His research focuses on risk management and decision-making under deep uncertainty. He's a member of the IPCC, also was the inaugural EADS Distinguished Visitor in Energy and Environment at the American Academy in Berlin, and also the inaugural president of the Society for Decision Making Under Deep Uncertainty. He's a professor of policy analysis at the Pardee Rand Graduate School, and he is the lead author of the book Shaping the Next 100 Years, New Methods for Quantitative Longer-Term Policy Analysis, which is a key publication in the DMDU field. He earned his PhD in Applied Physics from Harvard University. So Robert, thank you very much for making your time today. Before we start, I want to thank everyone for your time today. We're going to talk today about robust decision making. And just before giving the word to Rob, remember we have a weekly series of seminars in preparation for this year's annual meeting that will take place in November 10th, 12th in Monterrey, Mexico. Please visit the website of the annual meeting in the DMDU website so you can learn more about the sessions and how you can submit your abstracts. And very importantly, take into consideration that the deadline for abstract submission is May 17th, so it's approaching fast, and we are eager to receiving your abstracts and your ideas. Without further ado, Robert, please, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Edmundo, and thanks all. Look forward to speaking to you this afternoon. So I'm going to talk about robust decision-making, one of the approaches to decision-making under deep uncertainty. And let's see. The entire field of decision-making under deep uncertainty in many ways is motivated by this question. Certainly that's how to use quantitative information to make good policy choices. And in many areas, quantitative information is absolutely indispensable to see our way through the challenges. And while it may seem obvious that the best way to use quantitative analysis is to make predictions of the future, in many cases that actually gets in the way. I mean, predictions are the core principle of the scientific method, but when we're using them to inform policy questions when the uncertainties are deep, which we'll talk a lot about today, and when people disagree with one another, predictions can get in the way. And people disagree not only about predictions, which is things scientists do all the time, but in particular when people disagree about the consequences, the implications of various predictions, about the policy implications, about how it relates to their values, and then that reflects all the way up the chain and interferes with the way that the analytics can be used to help us see our way through to solutions. So fortunately, there is another way, and that's what this talk is about. That's what the DMDU field is about. So traditional risk management generally begins with a consensus understanding of the future. So this is much of decision analytics, much of the way one traditionally thinks of risk management. So this is a form called predict and act. We first say, what will future conditions be? In the sort of simplest cases, people make point forecasts for the future. Maybe they make one or two scenarios. In the full, most sophisticated way, one has a joint probability distribution over a set of future states of the world. Once we have a picture of what the future will be, we can use that to rank different policy alternatives, and then we may do some sensitivity analysis to see how sensitive our recommendation is to our assumptions. And this is predict then act, because we start with this prediction, this agreed view on the future, and then we use that to make our choices. And there are many problems for this where this approach works wonderfully. I mean, classically, engineers and scientists use this all the time, and this works well for systems which are complicated, which here's a standard definition from the complexity literature, but a system that has many nested components, but you can understand it through reductionism, looking at each piece individually. But many of the problems we deal today, as we increasingly understand, are ones which are complex systems with many, many interacting systems, which are difficult, whose behavior is difficult to predict. Now, in many cases, complex systems operate in stable modes where in fact they are relatively predictable, but we don't live in a world like that. This is the famous chart showing the great acceleration, which we all know these numbers, but it's sort of always surprising and just start to see them. This is the increase in population, GDP, urbanization, and you can put here greenhouse gases and a whole number of other factors, but how fast things have been changing over the last couple of decades. And the world we live in a fast changing and ever surprising world, which is, a point obviously made even easier to discuss while we're all locked down with this pandemic, which was not really on our radar screens just a couple of months ago. And then a key point is that disagreement over values all transfer back into these disagreements over facts. So even when the analytics is good, disagreements over values can complicate the discussion of facts. And then when there's deep uncertainty, it plays into it even more. And this is just sort of a wonderful set of graphs by Dan Kahan, who talks about cultural cognition. And this has to do with people's understanding of climate change, which is an area where I work in a lot. And so you can ask people, you can measure people's scientific and what they call ordinary scientific intelligence. And when you ask them questions which are scientific in nature, but have no policy consequence, like what gas makes up the majority of the Earth's atmosphere, this ordinary scientific intelligence correlates very well with the sort of answers you get. So the higher your scientific intelligence, the better you do. If you ask a question that has profound political and value implications, for instance, having to do with the causes of climate change, that goes away. In fact, there's no correlation between your scientific intelligence and giving the right answer. In fact, if you separate people out, this is US data, by political affiliation, you get a correlation for one group, you get an anti-correlation for the other group. But interestingly, if you ask something of a trick question, and this one is, what happens if the North Pole ice cap melts? There, actually, the conservative Republicans do a little bit better than the Democrats, because in fact, melting the ice doesn't raise sea level because the ice floats. But the people who are most worried about climate change tend to see any climate effect as bad. So this is just all to say that when you deal with deeply uncertain risks, there's a very complicated stew of factual disagreements coupled with value disagreements. Okay. And so under such conditions, these predict and act methods can break down. So instead of predict act, people often end up with tunnel vision. And in particular, there's huge pressure to underestimate the uncertainties, because if we admit how large they are, our ability to do analysis, at least the way we expect to, breaks down. Competing analyses can contribute to gridlock, and I'm sure many of you have had the experience of making a projection and then to justify a policy, and the people who don't like the policy attack the projection less than attacking the recommendation or the policy, because the policy may be more solid than the projection on which it's based. And then this idea that we often know a lot about a problem that is not very predictive, but in fact can help us sort our way through to good solutions. And even if we can't predict surprises, knowing about them can help us prepare. And these conditions we call deep uncertainty, and the definition is down here. It's when the parties to a decision do not know or do not agree on the likelihood of alternative futures or how actions are related to consequences. So essentially, we don't know the likelihood of one future relative to another, and we may have uncertainties about the model which connects our action to consequences. So these conditions calls for new methods and tools to do risk and decision analysis. And our traditional tools are designed for a world that we understand well, where there's agreement on objectives, and there's often we envision there being a single decision maker. Today we have problems where there's a diversity of priority and goals and values. We have this irreducible, this deep uncertainty, and then oftentimes there's multiple decision makers. On the right, I have a figure that I think Jan Kwakkel used in his talk a couple of weeks ago, where on the horizontal axis is the level of uncertainty. On the vertical axis is the amount of agreement over values. Most of our traditional tools are down in the lower left, where we're certain and we have a single measure of goodness, or we have risk that is well characterized by probabilities, and many real world problems are up in the upper right-hand corner. And then I think Pat Reed is going to talk in a week or two in this seminar series and discuss probably a little bit about this multiple decision maker problem, which she's got some very nice examples. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about robust decision making, which is one of these DMDU methods, give you an example application which shows you how it works, and then step back a little bit, discuss how you might use it, and discuss how it can help sort our way through these wicked problems and often support deliberations on these wicked problems. So for those of you who haven't seen it, there's a recent book out on decision-making under deep uncertainty. It goes through a whole variety of methods. This talk's focusing on robust decision-making. From my point of view, these are all variations on the theme. We could talk more about that if you like in the question period. Okay, what is RDM? This tries to capture it on a single slide. It's an iterative, multi-scenario, multi-objective decision analytic framework that helps us find robust strategies, those that work well over a wide range of futures, and therefore their good performance is relatively insensitive to the things we don't know about the future. It helps us characterize the vulnerabilities of such strategies, that after we've made ourselves invulnerable to many uncertainties, what are the key ones that remain, and help us understand the trade-offs among robust strategies. And fundamentally, RDM rests on just a very simple concept that rather than use our analytics, computers, models, and data as tools to predict the future, we're going to use them as exploratory devices to scan over many thousands to millions of futures, which computers can do for us, stress test policies against those futures, and use the results of those stress tests to help identify more robust strategies. And one way to think about this is we're essentially, instead of this predict then act flow, we're turning our analytics around, running the analysis backwards. So instead of starting out with what will future conditions be and going from there, we start out with one or more proposed strategies. This is what we might do, or here are some options. We use our analytics to answer the stress test those policies and answer the question, what sorts of futures will this policy meet our goals? Where will it miss our goals? Or if I've got a strategy A, a strategy B, under what sorts of futures should I prefer A to B, vice versa? Where are they roughly the same? And then use that information to think about how to improve our option set, what are the trade-offs among options, and ultimately help us decide which option to choose. So RDM really synthesizes four key concepts, very traditional concepts, but pulls them together in new ways. So first, it's a decision analytic structure. There's a broad field of decision analysis, which gives us decision structuring frameworks, helps us think about trade-offs, helps us choose among options. But it's often framed, much decision analysis is framed as prescriptive. It's essentially the analysis is designed to give us a definitive ranking of strategies. A second idea is that of scenarios, where we lay out multiple worldviews, not privileging one over the other. We often talk about plausibility, not probability, to allow these scenarios to make them more admissible to people who may disagree about the future. And rather than being prescriptive, scenarios are often deliberative. They help individuals, they help groups think and explore what they want to do. A third idea is stress testing or assumption-based planning, which is a set of ideas developed by a guy named Jim Dewar at Rand in the early 1990s, which is around the idea of stress testing a plan. So you begin with a plan, and then you see what are the key assumptions that it makes that might break it. And obviously the idea of stress test is common across engineering, finance use it. And this is, we're stress testing plans. And the final of the four ideas is this idea of exploratory modeling, which is a different way to use models, which is using models to map assumptions onto consequences, not to predict. And it's been made useful by ubiquitous computation. Let me just say a little bit more about that, because that's the thing that really makes this whole field go, is that this dichotomy of models came from our RAND colleague, Steve Bankus, again in the early 1990s. And he said that there's two types of models. You can think of two types of models in the world. One he called consolidative or predictive, but consolidative because they gather all the relevant knowledge you have into a single package. You can validate that model, and then you can use it for a surrogate for a real world. So again, I mean, this is what engineers do, that you have a model which tells you how the bridge is going to perform, how the plane will fly. You use it to understand how that option is going to work, and you expect that what you eventually build will work pretty much as the model says it will. You can use those predictions, and you spend a lot of time validating the model. There's a whole nother class of models, which is models that mapped assumptions onto consequences without privileging any one set of assumptions. And under conditions of deep uncertainty, it's very difficult to validate the models. You can't validate the models. I work in climate change. You can't validate a model of what's going to happen 10, 20, 30 years from now until it's too late to act on the consequences of those predictions. So these models are really just mapping assumptions and the consequences, and they're used for iterative problem solving. And again, these are all old ideas, but what is now new is we both have a lot more computer power, so we can take our models, run them anytime. We also have a whole suite of analytics, both some of the scenario, the machine learning, the classification algorithms that help us explore large databases, visualization tools, and robust optimization tools that help us work our way through strategies that work over many scenarios. So classic ideas now newly enabled by new capabilities. And so RDM integrates these four concepts into an iterative decision analytic process, laid out the three steps that I showed. The middle ones, we do the stress test. The stress test gives us scenarios, and so as I'll talk about a little bit later, one that scenarios are often thought of as inputs to the analysis. In RDM, scenarios are a product of the analysis. And over it all, we have inductive reasoning with exploratory models going both ways. Okay, so just to kind of pull it all together, RDM helps people make better decisions, not better predictions. A couple of basic principles: consider multiple futures, not a single one in their planning. We're going to use these futures to stress test your plans. Seek strategies which are robust, that is, perform well over many futures, not ones that are optimal for a single best estimate future or a single best estimate probability distribution. And make your plans flexible and adaptive, which is often the way to become more robust. So instead of trying to do predict and act, do scenarios. And just a couple of aphorisms, which I try to capture some of the idea. I think these ideas, Jan talked a couple of weeks ago about this idea of premature aggregation is the root of all evil in decision support. So we want to maintain multiple futures and multiple objectives as long as we can. And then this idea, which I'll get back to at the end, of seek certainty in your decisions, not in your predictions. Okay, so let me go through an example application, show you how this works. So this is a study we did a couple years ago, and the going in question is, can Los Angeles meet its water quality goals in the face of climate change? So the city of Los Angeles was preparing water quality plans to meet federal water and state water quality targets for the Los Angeles River. So this is the pictures, the hills looking down into the San Fernando Valley where the Los Angeles River flows and curls around downtown and then down out to the ocean. So LA put together plans to meet these targets. its consultants came up with a plan that looked roughly like this. This was a big optimization over the expected flows in the river, and not to go into the details, but about 45% of the plan measured in terms of how much pollutants were getting captured are in big regional projects, spreading basins, that sort of thing. About 22% are making the streets absorbing of stormwater, and low impact development that's on private lands, having private lands, houses and commercial property also absorb water. So that is the optimal plan. So they had put together this plan, however, without considering climate change. So they came to us and we helped them answer the question, once you consider climate change, is this still a good plan? Okay, so I've turned the flow diagram into essentially a checklist of steps. These are a checklist you can use in doing RDM analysis. Frame the decision analysis, stress test your strategies over a wide range of futures, and identify new or revised strategies that meet our goals over a wider range of relevant futures. Okay, let's start with step one. Okay, we often do this decision framing with this 2x2 matrix, which we call XLRM. This is standard decision analysis, but it turns out to be immensely useful. So you sit down with the stakeholders, you discuss what they're trying to do, what they're worried about, and you break up into 4 factors. What are people trying to achieve? What actions can they take that might help them achieve their goals? What uncertainties, things outside their control, might interfere or help with the ability of their actions to meet their goals? And relationships, what sort of analytics do we use to map levers and uncertainties onto these performance metrics? And in this LA water quality example, we'll start, the thing they care about is meeting the water quality requirements for reasonable cost. We started with the city's proposed plan, I should say plan, not play. And then in the second iteration, when we find the vulnerabilities of that plan, we go on and we look at some adaptive pathways. We're focused on 2 sets of uncertainties, climate change and land use. And then in this analysis, as in many RDM analysis, we're using the same high planning models that the city and its consultants use to deal with its regulators. We're just using those models in new ways. Okay, let's hop on to the next step, stress test. Okay, so we have our simulation models. We've organized our analysis according to these XLRM factors, and we now run the model many times. Each run has the city's plan and tests it against a different future. And we do this a whole bunch of times, and we collect all those runs into a big database. And in particular, this database, we looked at 47 different climate futures, which we extracted essentially the worst case futures from the IPCC ensemble. And we used 6 land use futures. So we had 282 futures. We stress test the city plan against these futures. Here's a big database. It essentially has this form that a blue dot is a future in which the city meets its regulatory targets, and a red dot is where it doesn't. Okay, so what do we do with this big database of futures? How do we make sense of it? So what we do is this, what we call this scenario discovery analysis. We run classification algorithms against this database, and we ask the question, how can we best separate this database into cases where the plan meets and misses its goals? And what are the key factors that are most important and do the best job in differentiating between the futures where the plan meets and misses the goals? You ask that question and you get this map here. Turns out that the 2 most important factors are the change in the intensity of the 24-hour rainfall. So a 1 means it hasn't changed at all. A 1.4 means that the 24-hour rainfall is 40% higher. And in the vertical axis, it's the impervious area of the city. And the horizontal lines are different land use scenarios, and the X shows the planning case that the city used, which is the current 24-hour rainfall event. This is the 90th percentile highest event, and current land use. There's then these 6 land use scenarios. The one that's second from the bottom, named newly mandated land use, is what the city would get if their recent stormwater master plan would go in. So what you learn from this, so this is the results, this separates, and now we can interpret these results as scenarios in the rather standard sense. We have 2 scenarios and 2 axes, and so it's the extreme rainfall event going from no increase to a large increase, and land use going from no change to large change. If you're in the gray area, the plan meets its goals. If you're in the red area, it misses its goals. The green X is the planning case. And now what we've learned is that climate change puts LA at risk of missing its water quality goals. It doesn't require very much change at all in the intensity of the 24-hour rainfall event for LA to start missing its water quality goals. But if they meet their newly mandated land use target, they will buy out a significant fraction of the climate risk. So now we ask, should this plan misses goals scenario worry policymakers? Is that something they should worry about? And so what we do now is we compare this scenario map to what scientific evidence we have. And the full range is essentially the range of IPCC climate projections. The vertical dashed lines are a study done by climate modelers at UCLA, Alex Hall and his group, and these are their best estimate range for what the change in extreme rainfall event would be in LA. And so both of these, this is essentially a lower and an upper bound in the range of uncertainty for the extreme climate event. But both of them essentially give the same area answer, which is the city is very vulnerable to climate change if land use doesn't change. If land use does change in their very optimistic scenario, they bought out most of the climate uncertainty. So, but in short, this is the climate impact on their plans is something they should worry about. So yes. Okay, so what do they do about it? Now we're going to use this information to identify new or revised strategies. So the stress test results suggest using a robust adaptive water quality implementation plan. So we're going to see if we can turn this a robust plan. One that, an adaptive plan that starts with near-term actions, monitor signposts, and we can pull the signposts directly off this, the scenarios that came out of the stress test. In particular, we begin with the current plan, but if the city fails to achieve mandated land use and climate science cannot guarantee storms stay small, we might want to augment the current plan and to one that works in that red region. If those two things don't happen, we can continue with the current plan. So that is one way that we might want to respond to this potential vulnerability. Should decision makers adopt this adaptive plan? Now we want to consider some alternatives. Here's the current plan. Here's the plan we just discussed. Begin with current plan, prepare to adjust. Or you could begin with the augmented plan and you could drop back to the current plan. How do we choose between these? RDM's designed to illuminate trade-offs to evaluate rather than dictate optimal solutions. So I'm just going to show you the trade-offs involved. So we have two main goals that we discussed earlier. We have water quality and cost. And we've turned this big uncertainty space into two scenarios, meet and miss goals, with a lot of definition of what those scenarios entail. Here's our three plans, and we're ranking them on each of the these attributes. All of these plans meet water quality, but the current plan meets it at lowest cost. The augmented plan meets it at the highest cost. With the current plan, prepare to adjust, in between, it's costs a little bit more than the current plan because you have to prepare to adjust, maybe by putting defraying the time that you release some land that you could turn into a spreading basin So you leave it as a golf course before you turn it into a development, that sort of thing. Here is now in the plan misses goals scenario. Here the augmented plan is lowest cost. The current plan misses its water quality target and then involves a lot of costs trying to catch up. And the current plan is again slightly higher because it incurs costs in monitoring and being flexible. So it looks like the adaptive begin with current plan but prepare to adjust. It represents a low regret strategy in that it meets water quality targets in both scenarios, and its cost is not always the lowest, but just slightly higher than the lowest cost possible strategy if you knew the future. So in general, a robust strategy is one that performs well over a wide range of plausible futures, keeps options open, or trades some optimal performance for less sensitivity to broken assumptions. You can express those all differently mathematically, but in this case, they all lead you to the exact same answer. Okay, let me just talk a little bit about how you would do this in practice and how this can support deliberation over wicked problems. So under what conditions is RDM most useful? Really, as you look at a problem, there's sort of three main things you want to look at. How deep is the uncertainty? How rich is your decision space, which I've labeled here as hedging opportunities, and how complex is the situation? And that's essentially a heuristic for how well can you guess the appropriate scenarios and all their key drivers. So if the uncertainty is not deep, if it's well characterized, or you have few hedging options, a predict and act approach, basically making your best estimates of the probabilities, is the better thing to do. But the deeper the uncertainty gets and the more opportunities you have to hedge, to have a rich decision space where you can begin to make policies that are adaptive over time, have a lot of different combinations of things you can do to give you a chance to come up with something that might be robust, the more robust decision making starts to make lots of sense. And then on this complexity axis, if a bunch of experienced people can sit down, come up with a few scenarios that make sense to them and that everybody that they're communicating with is going to agree with, then you can just do traditional scenario planning. But if the scenarios aren't obvious or you need a way to justify them to an audience, again, robust decision making starts to be an important thing to do. How do you get started with RDM? Well, to do this in an organization, you need people to engage, a model of your system, and you need people to do the analysis. In the analysis I just showed you, we use an existing model, which is often you can do a lot with. In some cases, you need to build a new model built for purpose, particularly one that's designed to look at adaptive strategies, to get some of the more uncertain but important connections that often aren't in planning models, and that often run faster. There's an increasingly a set of software to help you do this sort of analysis. There's the scenario discovery software that I showed. There's software to help you, you can wrap around models and run them many times. The deep uncertainty site talks all about those. In some sense, the people to engage is the biggest challenge, and it's often a challenge to bring RDM into an organization, but you can start with qualitative RDM methods, scenario methods, and then start moving to quantitative methods. You can adopt RDM incrementally, say in part of a planning cycle, and then move it out more broadly, or this idea of a shadow process where you've got a traditional planning process running and you do an RDM analysis alongside of it. They talk to one another, and as people get comfortable with the RDM analysis, they can start bringing it into the organization. Where can RDM go wrong? It's often more work than predict and act. You've got to run the model more times. You've got to do things that are maybe less familiar than you're used to doing. Oftentimes, if you've got a planning model that you've started, that you've been using to set it up, often one of the biggest barriers is just to set it up so you can run multiple times. You need at least some solid information. Yes, we're looking at worlds of deep uncertainty, but you need enough information that you can differentiate, find robust plans and make arguments that they indeed are robust. oftentimes the models you have focus on certain questions and they don't get at the, they anchor you in certain parts of the system and make it hard to get to other parts of the system. And then it's a new approach so that lots of people, at least when they start, do it poorly. Now, let me jump back and discuss this idea of wicked problems. And so, many of us are familiar with this, Riddle and Weber's famous paradox that the more skilled policy professionals get at analysis, the less people seem to listen to them. And the explanation for this, according to Riddle and Weber, is this idea of wicked problems. With tame problems, everyone agrees on the problem and objectives, so the experts can helpfully propose and implement the best answer. They contrast this to wicked problems, where people contest virtually every aspect of the problem, including what the problem is. And addressing wicked problems often requires an ability and a propensity to look at the world from many different worldviews, different clusters of beliefs, values, and preferences, and then engage in this iterative process of problem reframing, looking at the problem from different vantages, doing that in a deliberative process to see if one can't find a way to look at the problem which facilitates compromise on common actions. The problem is that while we often need quantitative information, predictive analytic tools are not often well designed for this sort of reframing process, because the analysis is organized around predictions, and the predictions basically privilege a particular worldview, a particular problem framing over others, and therefore can get in the way of this recognizing multiple worldviews and this process of iterative reframing. Often deliberative processes do help for wicked problems and do help you go through this process of frame reflection. In particular, a process which is called deliberation with analysis, which is an analytic deliberative process where stakeholders deliberate over problem framing. The analysts then provide policy relevant information related to those framing or framings. The stakeholders deliberate again and give new instructions back to the analysts, and you go back and forth like this. And this is a particularly useful process. We've used this in many of our RDM engagements. It's particularly useful where stakeholders, new framings emerge through stakeholders' interaction with each other and the analytics. And this is just a sketch of how RDM is designed to facilitate this sort of deliberation with analysis. The tools, the scenario part of the tools, it facilitates visioning and compromise. People can look at scenarios they might not have otherwise to look at. They can see the problem from different vantages. And then the idea of exploratory modeling allows you to ask these exploratory design questions. What if this, what if that, in structured ways. And in many of the sort of the signature successes, in this case, the Louisiana Master Plan for Sustainable Coast, have gone through these processes with these tools. It's interesting to ask, to what extent are the tools helping, and how do they help? That's obviously a hard thing to get at. There is an evaluation literature in the DMDU world. This is a study we did a couple of years ago, which we call testing the scenario hypothesis, where we set up in a laboratory setting the sort of process we had up there and tested predictions, forecasts based on probabilities versus a more scenario-based framing. And indeed, in this particular case at least, found that the scenario framing encouraged people to take a broader vantage and do a much better job, of finding robust strategies than did the probabilistic forecast. So at least you can create laboratory settings where you see some of these things occur in testable ways. So just return to the basic principles. When faced with deep uncertainty, consider multiple futures, not a single one. Choose those futures to stress test your plans. Seek robust plans, not ones that are optimal on a single best estimate future. Make plans flexible and adaptive, and use analytics to facilitate exploration and problem solving, not using the computer to tell people what to do. And just to end on this idea that RDM helps decision makers plan with confidence under conditions of deep uncertainty, or in other words, place their confidence in the plan and not the predictions. And so I very much like the upper quote. This is with one of the water agencies we were working with. They were in a big public meeting. The planner was asked, do you trust those climate models? And the planner replied that they didn't necessarily trust the climate models, but they had confidence in their contingency plans, which they developed using those models. So the confidence was in the plan, not in the predictions. And then the Francis Bacon quote, if we begin with certainties, we end in doubt. If we begin with doubts and patient in them, we shall end in certainties. So thank you very much, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Robert. Actually, we have quite a number of questions.
Great.
So let's do this. Let me read the first couple of the questions that we have on the Google form, and then we will open for the audience if you want to unmute your microphones and ask a question, or preferably if you just right-click on your name and raise your hand virtually, then we'll give you the word. Let me first start with this question from Antonio Sebastián from Tecnológico de Monterrey. He says, do you consider black swans in a RDM study? And if you do, how you do that?
Not as frequently as one would like, but on occasion we have. And the way to do that, or one way to do that, is to go back and forth between the modeling and human red teams, essentially. So what we've done is you do the RDM analysis, you come up with a robust strategy, and then you bring it before a group and you challenge them to come up with things which are not in the model, not in your analysis, which would break the robust strategy. And that actually turns out to be, at least sometimes, harder than you think, because what you're really looking for is something that reorders a bunch of carefully chosen strategies. So an asteroid hitting the Earth, or in some cases even a pandemic, is not going to change the ordering of your strategies. It may make the strategy, work less well than you thought, but it doesn't change, what you would do. You challenge people to come up with something that you haven't considered in the analysis that would break your strategy, give you a very different ordering, and then you go put those back in the modeling and see what answers you give you. So basically, this interplay between doing the analysis with the model and then doing these red teaming, it seems to work pretty well when you get a chance to do it. The challenge is in practical applications, you're often sort of running against money and time deadlines at the end, so you don't get a chance to do that.
Thank you very much, Rob. I have another question from Rui Shi from Johns Hopkins University. The question is, how do you identify the initial strategy for stress testing? If there is no strategy proposed by the decision makers, how do you identify the best timing to adapt?
So yeah, it's if you don't have an initial strategy from the decision makers, or they would like others in addition to whatever plan they currently have, you can do a more traditional optimization analysis, more traditional decision analysis at the beginning. So you might start out with the best estimate probability distribution and find the strategy that works for that. You might start with some scenarios and see what does, get a set of strategies for that. So do more traditional decision analysis to get initial strategies if you don't want to have to start. Was there another part to the question?
Yes, let me read again. How do you identify the timing for adaptation? I think that was basically the question.
Yeah. Okay. So I think Pat Reed will talk about that more next time. But one way to do it is that you may not have so much flexibility. The agency may make a decision every 5 years, so you just look at a small number of cases. But the general way to do it is to use some sort of robust optimization algorithm. That is one of the things that looks at is the timing of the responses. So one thing that people do, that we've done, other groups do, is you model the adaptive strategy using some sort of control theory, as a controller in a control theory sense, and the what it's observing and how sensitive it is to various observations and the target levels that you're looking for are part of the strategy. And your robust strategy is one, one of the things that you're varying in these algorithms, looking for good strategies, are the parameters of the controller.
Thank you very much, Rob. Actually, I have a bunch of questions in the form, but let's also open for some questions in the audience. I have one from Emmanuel Toral. Do you know if a similar study like the one in Los Angeles water has been done for renewables, wind energy somewhere?
I think you're going to have a talk about decarbonization plans in
Yes.
a couple of sessions. There was a RAND study a number of years ago, which did a stress test on U.S. Renewable portfolio targets, with the full up, which looked a lot like this one, and found the key vulnerabilities to that, which had to do with the biofuels part generated most of the vulnerabilities to that. So, yeah, but the quick answer is yes. And if you're interested, I can send some links to various studies.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Rob. I have another question from Tania Lopez Cantu. So, Tania, please go ahead. If you want to unmute your microphone and present your video or whatever you want, please go ahead.
Yes, sorry, I don't have my camera ready for the video, but I'll just tell my question. First,
Sure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lempert, for your overview on robot decision making. And my question is, do you think there is a limit in the applicability of the method, or every time that we encounter a situation with that we have to face deep uncertainty, should we apply these methods?
Yeah, no, good question. And I was trying to get at that a little bit with that cube that I showed a couple of slides ago. And, doing a full up RDM analysis can be more, can take more effort than doing a more traditional decision analysis. So I think it depends on those three factors that I talked about, how deep the uncertainty is, and how rich your options are. I mean, in particular, if it's a very binary choice, you can do A or B, or you're just setting a price on something. There may be few enough hedging opportunities so that it may be best just to work with your best estimate probability distribution, maybe put in a little safety factor and just do that. So so there may be cases where the extra effort is not worth it, and then there are cases where just a straightforward scenario analysis may get you much of what you need. So I would go to that cube as sort of the place. And then there may be organizational constraints where, the problem may be, just made for a full robust decision-making analysis, but, an organization just kind of can't, isn't ready for it. So you do, you bring in, maybe you just do a more traditional scenario analysis because they can get their heads around that.
Yes, I'm asking this question because I have tried to apply robot decision making to the design of a stormwater infrastructure, and sometimes when I go to the decision maker, they're like, well, yeah, we're concerned about all these different pipes failing and flooding, but if this one in this local street fails, well, we're not that concerned, I guess. So sometimes my point is, do we have to look first at the outcomes of the possible futures, kind of to give us an idea of should we apply like a more detailed analysis throughout all these scenarios in order to be more robust, I guess.
Yeah, once you've, I mean, maybe we should talk more offline. But
oh,
I mean,
so yeah, sorry, I'm taking.
Yeah,
too
no,
much
that's
time.
fine. That's fine. Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, but I mean, from your description of it, I mean, it sounded like that is some combination of people, not being sufficient, of being uncomfortable with new methods for whatever set of reasons, not being sufficiently worried about the deep uncertainties,
Yes,
for good or bad reason, or just having a siloed system where they, in fact, they are not institutionally responsible for the bad consequences. That if they meet the current code, they're okay no matter what happens.
That's right. Yes.
And in fact, and if they do something different and something goes wrong, they may be more in trouble than if they had just done the same old thing, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So that's another set of problems. Yeah.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very much.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Rob and Tanya. Let me get back to another question to the from the Google form. This is from Victor Espinosa from Tecnológico de Monterrey. When we don't have an existing model and we're building one from scratch, what are your recommendations for developing these models?
Yeah.
And of course, he implies using them in an RDM study.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you have the ability to do so, you should start simple and build from there, and think of it as an iterative design process. So, and learn. Start with a simple model to start getting a sense. You find your way around the problem and add detail as called for, as as the analysis suggests. You need more detail.
Thank you very much, Rob. Balkan, please unmute yourself and answer your question.
Hi, thanks a lot, Robert, for a very interesting presentation. My name is Balkan Devlan from University of Copenhagen. My question is, how can we apply robust decision-making procedures and ways of thinking to foreign policy? And I mean, I can see about defense procurement and stuff like that. But more broadly in the foreign policy domain, how can we apply them? Thank you very much.
We have a couple of examples. I mean, obviously a challenge. Stephen Popper and I, a number of years ago, did an exercise where we actually got a number of fairly high-level U.S. diplomats. I think they were all not in the government at the time, but we took them through an exercise where we constructed a mental model, basically just a bunch of influence diagrams, and then used that influence diagram to do an RDM analysis on U.S. policy towards Iranian weapons proliferation. If you like, there's actually a wonderful book by a RAND colleague, a guy named David Lempert, who was actually on the National Security Council and handled the U.S. side of the reintegration of Europe when the Cold War, when the Berlin Wall fell, and then wrote a book about foreign policy decision-making and let me write about 10 pages in the back about how some of these tools might help. So I will send you a link to that, which tries to speculate a little bit about how you would use these in a foreign policy decision-making session.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. Let me just get one more question from the Google form. The question is from Ali Sera Bailen from Alham Tabatabai University. And the question is, how does RDM model deal with the cognitive aspects of decision-making, especially when working with different stakeholders in strategizing workshops?
Okay, good question. Though RDM is a way of using models. It's not a model itself. So just I was like to make that clear. But the idea is that RDM is following sort of the cognitive ideas built into scenario thinking, which is you're trying to expand the set of futures that people will consider by making them non-threatening at the beginning. So the idea is that people often fight about forecasts because they know full well that once you settle on the forecast, it implies certain policy outcomes. And so they fight over the forecast. And you see that all the time. A more scenario-based idea is that you offer scenarios as what ifs, that here's a potential case. You don't have to commit yourself to saying that is what's going to happen or is likely or likely enough to do anything about. But if that were to occur, what might we do about it? And that's the sort of the way that scenarios aim to reduce cognitive barriers. And RDM uses the same approach. And ideally, it allows you to get to the point of letting people identify robust strategies, one that work over a wide range of futures, that they are willing to consider doing. And at that point, once they've had the problem solving and, okay, we might consider doing this, then it becomes easier for them to accept some of the futures that at the beginning they might have been scared to admit might be possible because they were worried about the implications for then, what actions that implied. And that we've actually measured a little bit, that people were more willing to consider adverse futures once they were comfortable with the solutions to those futures being less bad than they thought they might be at the beginning.
Thank you very much, Rob. We have 2 more questions from Guillermina. Can you use traditional scenario planning in the MDU?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes sometimes scenario planning is part of DMDU, and sometimes it's a little bit outside. I tend to, if we're going to talk about scenario planning, we'll talk about quantitative and qualitative at DMDU, and include scenario planning within it. So yes, I would say that scenario planning, traditional scenario planning, is a form of DMDU. It just is not. We're using expert judgment and not quantitative decision aiding tools to help choose the scenarios.
Thank you, Rob. One more question from Tony Weaver, who has his virtual hand raised. Tony, please go ahead.
Thank you, Edmundo, and I really appreciate the opportunity to ask you a question, Robert. I'm from Alluvium Consulting in Australia. Trying to push robust decision-making and decision-making under deep uncertainty in many of my projects.
Okay, great.
One of the challenges that I see is the framing of the choice scenarios that you were explaining there. And I really liked your example. I work in the water quality field and low impact design, so it really gelled. But one of the challenges that I see is that the current scenario is usually not static. It can deteriorate over time, as well as the alternatives. Whether you're talking about implementing low impact design, it doesn't happen. You don't get 100% adoption and so on. How do we set up these scenarios to handle a deteriorating current or future condition then into the robust decision-making framework?
Yeah, let me reframe your question a little bit, which is really good.
That's right.
But yeah, so and I think the reframing is, how do you capture the time element of scenarios which consist of model runs, which are time series. So yes. What I showed you in the water quality example, had meet and missing goals, but that was basically any time in the time period. And so, those were all 20-year, going out to 2035. Yeah, so they were all, roughly 20-year runs at the time, and did not make any differentiation. What you want to do is add a time dimension, which adds some complexity to the analysis. But be able to display somehow, how you're doing in different time periods. And so that's either going to be more dimensions to your objectives, or, or making clear, where it is. So in what the setup you described, I mean, it sounds like you want to look at different time periods, maybe, the next 5 years, and then, maybe 20 years out, or look at the next 5 years, and then, report problems, the time horizon where problems start to arise as another thing. So just, because what I hear you saying is that you're looking at situations where you run the model over, 10, 20 years, and the performance metrics are okay in many scenarios in the near term, but then being to degrade in the longer term, and you want to capture both those ideas.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. That makes a lot of sense.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much, Tony. And unfortunately, we have more questions on the Google forum, and but we have run out of time. Rob, thank you very much for your time. This has been a wonderful presentation. We thank you very much for having given us the opportunity to listen to your seminar, and the rest of the audience. Thank you very much for participating. Just friendly reminder, next week we will have Patrick Reed from Cornell University talking about multi-objective optimization and robust infrastructural pathways. I'm sure that's also going to be a very interesting presentation. And please check out our annual website so you can see what's going on with the annual meeting that's going to happen this year in Monterrey, Mexico. And be aware of the abstract deadline submission coming to us fast on May 17. And with that, we thank you all for your time. It has been a pleasure. See you next week.